When Steve and I were appointed by the Congress to serve as co-chairs, we were handed by the Congress, the members of the committee. We had nothing to say in their selection. Turned out to be pretty good people, but I want to say it was not our choices. And they were half Democrats and half Republicans, because the Congress thought this needed to be a bipartisan effort. And the idea of bipartisan in the congressional mind is that the Democratic appointees would represent their points of view and the Republicans would represent their points of view, and somehow we get a combination of views from this. At our first meeting, or before our first meeting, Steve and I met and decided that wasn't the way we wanted to operate. So at our first meeting, we told the members three things. First of all, we intended to operate not as a bipartisan group, but as a nonpartisan group. Very important distinction. That is, we would seek to find the right answers, not seek to find a balance between Democratic and Republican views. Secondly, we intended to produce a consensus report. Consensus with no footnotes, all agreement. And finally, we intended to reach, in spite of that consensus report, we intended the report to have significant findings, conclusions, and recommendations. We were going to water them down to get to the consensus. Those are pretty bold objectives that we set. I believe that we achieved all three of those goals. And that was only possible because of the close bond between Steve and myself, the two co-chairs, and because of Steve's incredible skills as a negotiator. I just stood by and wondered and watched him as he handled the reconciliation that was necessary to get this kind of report. Today, we're going to give you a summary of the findings of our commission, and we're going to start off with Steve.
I just want to mention that it was Bill Perry's leadership that got this very diverse group to decide that, in fact, a consensus report was the right thing to do. And one of the things he came up with early on was that an insight that the way to get a consensus report is not necessarily to go to the lowest common denominator, but it's actually to be bold and let your panel know that your report could be a vehicle for getting important ideas that many of the panel members had been pushing for a long time to a broader audience. And the second thing we did was we had a process that invested the members of the commission in the report. We divided into panels. We had individual panels actually write sections of the report and then incorporated that into the text. And it was really that process and Bill's leadership that resulted in a consensus report. And as we know from the Deficit Reduction Commission, getting a consensus is not easy in Washington these days, and it's really a tribute to Bill's leadership. The purpose of the independent panel, of course, was to review the Quadrennial Defense Review. This is a document that the Department of Defense prepares every 4 years, and it outlines what is defense policy and strategy, what are the force structures, resources that are required to achieve that strategy. And the Congress asked for this independent review. And they pushed us very hard early on in 4 directions. One, they wanted a 20-year horizon, which is a long way to plan in anything. They wanted us to develop force structure alternatives. They wanted us to do it in a budgetarily unconstrained environment. And they wanted us to look beyond the wars in which we were currently engaged. We did that, and one of the things that we did, and one of the things that Bill said to the committees of Congress very early on, is that this is a wartime Quadrennial Defense Review, or QDR, and that Bob Gates was right to make it a wartime QDR and to put as a priority fighting and winning the nation's wars and doing what we needed to do to support our men and women in uniform in that effort. That was a correct focus. But in addition, we tried to look beyond the current wars at the prospects for 21st century conflict. where were we going to be headed from a national security and defense policy standpoint? We tried to look at the so-called grand strategy of the United States. Did we have one, and if so, what is it? And what we found looking at that effort is that it's very difficult prospectively to articulate something that looks like a grand strategy for a national security and defense policy. Everybody talks about NSC 68, which is a magnificent document. But as Brent Scowcroft used to say, and still says, that was an easier time. One of the virtues of the Cold War was that at any point in time, your president and national security staff was worried about one big thing, the Soviet Union, and a couple little things, the crises or negotiations of the day. The world today is very different since the end of the Cold War. At any point in time, you've got about 12 pots on the stove, and all of them are near boiling. And in that kind of world, with a variety of challenges, it's very difficult to have something that looks like a coherent grand strategy. 3 administrations have now tried to articulate one, and I think our independent panel thought none had done it particularly well. That said, we did define that you could discern what our grand strategy has been retrospectively by looking at what decisions presidents had made, particularly with respect to use of force. And when we did that, we found 4 enduring security interests of the United States. And this, in some sense, drove our analysis. And they are the following: defense of the American homeland, the assured access to sea, space, air, and cyberspace, the preservation of a favorable balance of power across Eurasia and preventing authoritarian domination of that region, and helping to provide for the global common good through things like humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and disaster release. Now, what we found was that there are 4 trends affecting our ability to protect and advance these interests. And these 5 global trends were radical Islamic extremism and the threat of terror, the rise of new global great powers in Asia, particularly China and India, the continued struggle for power in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, and of course the focus on Iran, an accelerating global competition for resources, and the persistent problems of failed and failing states. These were going to be the challenges and also the opportunities for pursuing our core interests in the time ahead. We looked at the issue of soft power, believed that we needed to do a better job of coordinating soft power, so-called soft power, in pursuit of our national interests, but thought, regrettably, in the challenges we faced, hard power is going to be a key element of dealing with a number of the challenges we face. And finally, we emphasize the need for continuing American leadership globally. One of the keys for achieving our interests, protecting our interests, advancing our interests in this global environment is what we called a comprehensive approach to achieving our objectives. There's been a lot of talk recently about the whole of government approach, getting all departments and agencies of the U.S. government in a coordinated way pursuing a strategy to achieve national objectives. Our view was that there are other actors in most of these problems that need to participate and to be taken into account, and these are our allies and other nations, the NGO and private voluntary organization communities, and of course international organizations. And so what we need is, yes, a whole-of-government approach to get the U.S. government organized to pursue a strategy toward a common set of objectives, but we need a comprehensive approach that also coordinates this broader set of actors. And that requires the ability and developing the ability to plan, train, exercise, deploy, and operate in the field, in the theater, on a coordinated basis, bringing together all these assets and resources.